Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Well, when you're Prime Minister of Canada in very difficult economic times, there is no shortage of free advice. There seems to be a problem, though, trying to find good advice. And that seems to be the situation that we're facing right here, that Prime Minister Carney is facing. Case in point is a recent op-ed piece that appeared in the Calgary Herald a couple of days ago. The author of the piece is one Preston Manning. Now, for those who may not know, Mr. Manning is a former leader of the Alliance Party at one point, which became the Reform Party that spawned, well, the likes of Stephen Harper and other folks like that. At one point, he was the leader of the opposition in Parliament. And there's a story behind that as well. Mr. Manning, of course, being the quote-unquote populist, self-styled populist anyway, was one of those that said, the MPs' pensions are dreadful, they're awful. If I become Prime Minister, we're going to stop that. And by the way, if I'm opposition leader, I'm never going to go into Stornoway. That's taxpayers' money, and that's ridiculous that they should be spending it. Well, he did become the opposition leader and moved into Stornoway. And my information is he's not, as late as today, he's still collecting an MP pension. So he's one of these guys that says, listen to what I say, don't watch what I do, which is not what we want from elected officials. But anyway, I've always had a problem with the somewhat of a hypocritical nature from Mr. Manning. But I read the article because I do want to have informed opinion and credible opinion and things that are going to be somewhat helpful. I'm not sure that Mr. Manning's op-ed piece met any of those criteria, but let's talk a little bit about that and dissect it. He title of the piece, by the way, is Carney, Trump, and Rocket Richard, the best defense is a good offense. Well, that's very Canadian and very hockey-ish, right? So I suppose that's apropos to what he wanted to do here. And he spends the first part of it talking about Rocket Richard, the great Montreal Canadian player of the 50s and 60s, basically saying that when he gets across the blue line, he doesn't quite know what he's going to do. Not quite sure how that applies to what's going on here, but Manning tries to make some sort of a connection there, suggesting that here we are now, fast forward to the problems that we're facing now with Prime Minister Carney and Donald Trump. And he does in the first part here, I think, a pretty good job of outlining just exactly what the problems are here, some of the false claims that Trump has made about a fentanyl crisis at the border and on and on and on, and unfair practices with steel and aluminum, none of which, of course, have any credibility at all. And that is the problem that we face. Then he gets into his take on this. Well, that's when things, I think anyway, kind of fall off the rails. He says, in goal for defending Canada's interest is a former, calls him high-level bureaucrat, someone who is accustomed to working in the polite, predictable, and orderly environment of central bankers, referring to Mark Carney, of course. Now, Mr. Carney Prime Minister Carney now, was with the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. But let's put this in perspective. He was also, of course, an advisor for G7 and G20 meetings. He knows, and they know, most of the world leaders. He's had a face-to-face with Donald Trump and with Macron and others for time. He didn't sit in the back down in some little cubbyhole in an office. He was out there. He was on the front lines working with these. And let's talk a little bit about that work, suggesting that he was working in the polite, predictable, and orderly environment. This was the guy who was the Bank of Canada governor during one of the worst, if not the worst, economic recessions that this country has ever faced back in 2008, 2009. And it was instrumental in pulling Canada out of this. Now, I know that there are conservatives that are going to say, oh, no, that's not true. Well, yeah, it was Stephen Harper, who was the prime minister at the time, and Jim Flaherty, the late Jim Flaherty, who was the finance minister, who both heaped praise on Mark Carney for the great work that he did to try to move Canada forward and to get us out of that hole that we had found ourselves in because of this. So, what they said then, of course, they tried to dismiss later on because Carney became the Liberal leader. But the facts are the facts. So it's not as if this guy just sat back and had a nice quiet ride as the Bank of Canada governor. At the same time, of course, later on when he was recruited to run the Bank of England, Brexit landed on his lap. Didn't cause it, but he got the crap thrown right at him here, and he had to fix this. And while the conservative leaders, David Cameron had stepped aside, of course, when they lost the Brexit vote, but the other leaders, including Boris Johnson and others, were busy hand-wringing and pointing accusing fingers at each other. It was Carney, as the Bank of England governor, who developed policies and tried to move the government back and get them back on track financially. And it was a monumental task to try to do that. Somebody had to take the lead, and it was Mark Carney that did that. So For Mr. Manning to suggest that this is just a predictable, orderly environment is hardly the case, and that's not the sort of history that Mark Carney has shown. He's been the guy who's been able to fix some of those problems, notwithstanding the fact that it was some of the political leaders of those days that were probably contributory to the problems that we're in. But that's his perspective, and those are the facts. And I think the disconnect there is rather interesting. But then he gets into how Carney can actually try to deal with this. How can we better Canada's position for him? And not surprisingly, given his partisan nature, first thing Manning suggests is fire anybody that ever had anything to do with Justin Trudeau. I'm not a fan of Justin Trudeau. People that have watched this podcast for the last little while, or even back to my radio days, know that I was never a fan of Trudeau. Had a lot of problems with the way that he governed. But to suggest that everybody who was ever in government with him is tainted and therefore needs to be excused is, I think, a very naive approach to this. The Dominic LeBlancs, the Christy Freelands, and others, Champagne and others, have their credibilities and they have their talents. And by the way, there is that element that we've talked about in podcasts past, that no matter which minister it is, they work at the behest of the Prime Minister, okay? The Minister of Finance, the Minister of the Environment, whatever the case might be, they don't freelance. And nobody should know that better than Harper, because one of his prize students when he was in the Reform Party, young Stephen Harper, became Prime Minister. And the line in the Conservative caucus is, you don't cross the boss. This is the policy. This is what you're supposed to do. And if you don't, you're out. Well, that's how Prime Ministers work, no matter if it's Justin Trudeau, Stephen Harper, or anybody else. So I'm not going to damn some of those people in cabinet just because they were associated with Trudeau, although I still have my problems with Trudeau. He seems to have confidence in this. Mark Carney's been through financial crises before. He's picking a team. And he feels that LeBlanc is a guy who can work with this. And the strengths and weaknesses, I guess we could debate and argue for quite some time now. But Freeland and LeBlanc were involved in some of the negotiations in the previous NAFTA negotiations. So they're not new to this, and they have had some modicum of success. So to simply dismiss them because, well, their boss before that was an idiot or a jerk or whatever phrase you want to use, I think is really, as I say, a rather naive approach. And we have to judge them by the work that they're doing here, not by what happened in the past. So there's that. But again, I expect a little more from Preston Manning to just simply get partisan about these sorts of things, and I find that somewhat problematic. But that seems to be the nature of what's going on here. He also suggests that one of the things that needs to be done here is, well, I'll paraphrase here: ignore the premiers. He says, do not showcase an unorganized gaggle of provincial premiers posing for photo ops, but instead, he says, mobilizing the likes of Danielle Smith and Scott Moe to move Trump by getting to his populist base. First of all, Scott Moe and Danielle Smith have been the two premiers who have shown the least interest in putting Canada first. Their own self-interest with Saskatchewan and certainly with Alberta, I think, has been prevalent in a lot of these discussions. And it's worrisome, quite frankly, because there seems to be an awful lot of evidence that both Moe and Smith are working or trying to work side deals on the side with U.S. counterparts to try to get the best deal instead of looking at a Canada-wide solution to this. So to suggest that you put those two out front, I think is a ridiculous idea, frankly, and something that is probably contrary to Canada's best interests. To try to bring them on side, I think would be a much better idea. As for the other premiers, yes, there are some who are rather bellicose and some who may be a little bit off the rails from time to time. But the premiers of this country have a role to play here. They run their economies in those particular provinces. And whether it's steel, aluminum, whether it's agriculture, potash, go down the list, the premiers do have a say in this and could offer some advice and some strong support for this. Manning's idea that they simply be dismissed is, well, maybe not, again, surprising, because, again, his star pupil, Stephen Harper, when he was Prime Minister, had little to nothing to do with the premiers of the province and actually showed a great deal of disdain. I think he only had one meeting with the premiers in all the 10 years that he was the Prime Minister of this country. Of course, Carney's already had 4 or 5 of these already, whether they're teleconferences or not. And what Carney is talking about is the Team Canada approach, and you've got to have everybody at the table for that to happen. And I applaud him. I think this is one of the approaches that Canada has been lacking in the last little while. We can't run, as Carney talked about during the election campaign last year, you can't have 11 different economies and then try to have a united voice for Canada. There's got to be some unanimity here. And Manning clearly doesn't understand that, but I think Carney does. And that's going to work to our best interests and with what's happening here. He also talks about something Carney must do is that bring business advisors, labor advisors into the table here. He's already done that. we've talked about this. As a matter of fact, we've seen on the talk show circuit, on David Cochran's show, Vashi Capello's show, a number of people from the industry that are advisors to Mark Carney when it comes to dealing with the United States. And he does consult with them, and he does talk with them about what's going on in the States and Canada's reaction to this. So to suggest there's something he needs to do, I think, Mr. Manning, please, catch up with the media here, or catch up with what's going on in the world and with current events. It's already happening. It's all part of, again, this Team Canada approach. And I know that sounds kind of trite and cliche-ish to say Team Canada, but that's what it really has to be at this stage. Trump is totally unpredictable, off the rails, and we could talk about his mental acuity or lack of, which is a factor here too. But at the same time, you need a steady hand, and Carney provides that right now. Does that mean that we're going to get the deal of a lifetime and Canada's best deal in a matter of days, weeks, or months? No, let's not be naive about this. And Carney, I think, has talked to us about that and been pretty clear that, look, this is going to be a tough road. There's a lot going on right now, and you're dealing with an unstable leader. And other parts of the world, other countries of the world are being adversely affected by this, and we need to be aware of that. This is, I know some people are thinking that Trump is specifically targeting Canada here, and there might even be some evidence to that end, although I think I have a pretty good idea why, and we've talked about this in an earlier podcast. Trump envies Canada. He envies our steel industry, our aluminum industry, our softwood lumber industry, the critical minerals that are evident here that he would just love to get his hands on, and fresh water, which they don't talk about much, but they sure do down in the States, about Canada's fresh water supply. He would love to have Alberta as a separate state, or Saskatchewan as a separate state, and have access to those minerals and those resources. So he's got a bone to pick with Canada right now, because we're not going to do that. We're not going to become part of the United States, and that pisses him off. Nobody says no to Donald Trump, at least down in the States they don't anyway. And if more people said no to him on a global basis, and even down in the States, then maybe the tyrant wouldn't have the kind of power that he has these days. But again, we go back to Manning's op-ed piece here to suggest that, if you follow this advice, it's already being done. And it's not going to give us the immediate result that we want. It's a process that's going to take time. And one of the things that I think has really been problematic in these negotiations, such as they are, and I know that the United States wants to characterize this as Canada not being sincere about this. The problem is the United States changes their mind every 24 hours, if not more often than that. They may come to some agreement about, the dairy industry and supply management or something, and the next day Trump just changes his mind. Well, how do you negotiate with somebody like that? You can have Dominic LeBlanc, you can have anybody you want in there too, but at some point, there's got to be some consistency from the other side. And what's holding us back from finding a deal that's going to be good for Canada and good for the United States is, quite frankly, the desire to try to find a deal. And the United States, as we've said, is not looking to make a deal. They're simply looking to dictate terms, and if you don't agree, then you will be punished with tariffs. That's the Trump mythology and the Trump philosophy that's been going on for many, many years, and now we're getting it, with both barrels. So it's problematic, which is all the more reason why it's extremely important that we have some sense of unanimity here. Not everybody's going to agree on this side of the border with the way that we're doing things, but, the faster you go, the more chances you have of stumbling, and we can't afford to stumble right now. What we need during this very critical time in this country, we need people who do put Canada first. Not Alberta first, not Saskatchewan first, not Quebec first, Canada first. Because if Canada benefits, all of those other parts of that country will benefit as well. We've got to put somebody who's going to say Canada first and put partisan politics aside. Somebody who can offer constructive analysis and advice to try to move us forward in this. And judging from this op-ed piece, don't forget this is the same Preston Manning that wrote a piece just before the election, said if Canada votes for the Liberals and puts Carney in there, everybody's going to separate. Alberta's going to go, Saskatchewan may go, and that's going to be the end of this country. We don't need the doom and gloom, especially when it's unfounded such as this. What we need right now are people that believe in Canada and believe in Canada's future. And with this op-ed piece, sadly, it looks like Mr. Manning has once again shown that he's, just not up to it. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks so much for being with us. Catch us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, by the way, don't forget to hit the notification bell. Check the podcast description. Lots of further reading material that we include every time we drop one of these. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Your loyalty to the podcast is heartening. I'm really glad to see so many new people coming on here. We really do appreciate that. But by subscribing, you help the podcast to grow, and we can support the work that we're doing here, too. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed. Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.